Evan Miyakawa. Evan Mia. It's EVANMIYA.com. He does a great job with analytics. We've had him on from the time he started all this and now taking off. And I saw Evan, I don't know who it was, but was it Terrence Oglesby who saw your newfound part of what you're doing with analytics and said, just let Evan run the tournament. So thanks for your time. It's Craig today and also with me. What is the newest part of what you do that maybe is something unique that hasn't been a part of it? Okay, hold on. Garrett?
1 second. Evan, hang on. Okay, check your audio. Hang on.
Trying to get you.
Oh, sorry. I think I was muted on my end.
Yeah.
Can you guys
Okay.
hear me now?
There you go. There you go.
Okay, yeah. So to answer your question, I just recently unveiled a new team ratings model at my website that is kind of a groundbreaking new approach to measuring how good teams are, specifically looking at how they would match up against other types of teams. So essentially, it's still based on how good your offense is, how good your defense is, but a new component is that specific to each team, there are things that measure how you might match up with other specific styles of teams. So, for example, one of the biggest ones is some teams are really, really good at beating up on teams that they are favored against. Houston is a great example of this. Houston, anytime that they are a comfortable favorite in a game, they always seem to knock the socks off of their opponent, and they don't struggle at all with beating teams that are worse than them. But when Houston plays some of the tougher teams on their schedule, they're still good, but they may not be quite as elite as some of the numbers might typically suggest on other websites. You have other teams that are kind of the opposite. They might struggle to put away bad teams, but against the best competition, they typically play their best games. So I have found a new way of measuring this, and essentially I resort and rank the teams on my website based on how they would actually match up head to head. So at a lot of the other mainstream college basketball analytics websites, like a KenPom.com, for example, Houston's comfortably number one, has been there for a while because they're just so good against a lot of the teams on their schedule. But on my website, they're behind UConn and Purdue because I would actually have UConn and Purdue favored to beat them head to head because they've proven more that they are good against the best competition, even if Houston's more likely to beat up on a bad team, for example. Baylor is very interesting in this conversation because they are also one of these teams this year that has been great against teams that are bad to middle tier, bottom of the Big 12. They've handled business against those teams comfortably. But in their biggest games this year, Baylor has come up a little short. And from a predictive sense, I'm anticipating that this will continue going forward for them, which might be a little bit of a red flag if we're talking about Baylor advancing far in the tournament. They might be very comfortable to win their first two games, but after that, it might be a little bit of a stretch.
Evan, I don't know if you can, answer this or not, but I'm sure have you seen the ACC coaches that have talked about the Big 12 scheduling and kind of the trick that they pulled? Is there anything in your formulas and the numbers that you look at that can kind of back up what Jeff Capel or Clemson's coach was saying as opposed to the Big 12 and their defense of how they're ranked in some of these ratings?
Yeah, I found that discussion to be fascinating because essentially ACC coaches are sort of claiming that the Big 12 only looks good based on the numbers just because of their tricks that they've pulled off in scheduling lots of bad teams in non-conference. Now, certainly, if you are a good team at beating up on bad teams, that can look good on your in terms of your metrics, but you still have to actually perform against those teams. So when we've seen the Big 12 in non-conference play other conferences, the ACCs, the Big Easts, the Big Tens, the Big 12 has been the best conference in those games amongst high major teams. And then for all of those other non-conference games where Big 12 teams have been comfortable favorites against low majors and mid majors, they've knocked the socks off all of them. So even if your argument is that the Big 12 has skated by having an easier schedule, that doesn't discount the fact that they still have performed really well in those games. Now, my relative ratings do account for some of that, where essentially when I'm rating teams in the top 50, it doesn't care quite as much about how you played against teams that are, say, below the top 200. But in that, it still comfortably has the Big 12 as the best conference in basketball.
So, yeah, we had Scott Drew on that. People can change this. Is this the ACC posturing, wanting maybe another team or two to be considered, or is this you can be right both ways, right?
I agree. I think you can make a complaint that the Big 12 has had a weak non-conference schedule. I don't necessarily think that that's not a fact. But equally, I think the Big 12 has handled the business they're supposed to handle, perhaps in an even more emphatic way than other conferences might have. So I think both can be true.
Evan Miyakawa with us on 365 Sports. All right, let's get into it. Big 12, we had Jerry Palm on yesterday, and you know he crunches numbers and does it for CBS Sports, and there's obviously what Joe Lunardi does with bracketology. 8 teams or 9 get in your opinion, based on what you have in front of you?
Oh, boy. You know, I don't delve so much into the bracketology on my website because a lot of my stuff is predicting how these teams are going to play in the future. So I feel like it could go either way on it. Honestly, I think a lot of this is going to come down to just how the committee sees it. You know, do they really buy into the fact that the Big 12, for most of this season, based on what the analytics have shown, based on how the Big 12 teams have performed, you know, the Big 12 has been, entering conference play, the best conference in the country. How much weight do they put on that ultimately? Because once you get into conference play, teams beat up on each other, but that shouldn't really influence too much how good you think a conference is, because once you're within your conference play, it's all kind of relative to how good, all those teams are, right? So I think a lot of it's going to come down to how the committee sees it, as opposed to, 1 or 2 teams and their resumes. I think it has more to do with the strength of the conferences as a whole.
Of the teams that are highly ranked, is there somebody within what you have, and I have your top 10 teams in front of me, that is an outlier or a surprise? Is it Auburn as highly ranked as you have them? Alabama's been scoring 100 points a game. Is there somebody inside your top 10 that maybe is not that way when it comes to the ratings?
Yeah, I think Auburn's an interesting one. Auburn has been kind of a surprise team all season. And I think one of the things that's kind of grabbed my attention with Auburn is that by and large in big games, they've really showed up and they've performed well. Now with Auburn, part of why they've been so successful, especially in SEC play this year, is because their home court advantage has been huge. I mean, they're unstoppable at home for the most part. And so that's obviously not something that they're going to be able to rely on in the tournament where we play games on neutral courts. So that'll be interesting there. Honestly, I think a lot of the top 10 in my ratings kind of aligns pretty closely with, the AP poll. Maybe one exception would be Alabama. I have them 8th right now. But one thing I will say about Alabama is they have this scorching offense that's played really well, but they are one of those teams like a Houston, like a Baylor, that has played better in some of their games that they are favorites in. And they haven't been quite as elite in against maybe top 15, top 20 teams. So I'm not quite sure that they can make a deep run in March as some of those other teams, but they're certainly been surprising to a lot of people.
Evan, the Kevin McCullough part of the equation for Kansas is obviously a huge deal, but just what have the numbers told you about the Jayhawks and how much of a deficiency are we talking with McCullough and without him in comparison?
I specifically measure when players get injured. I measure how much of a difference that makes on their team outlook. That's something you can actually access on my website. So with McCullough, I have Kansas as a top 15 team. I have them 13th in the country. And with him out, they're outside the top 20. In terms of their upcoming game against Baylor, that's moving the game prediction line by about 2 to 3 points there. That may not seem like a lot, but the difference over the course of a season between a team that's 2 points better or 2 points worse is pretty significant when we're talking about, title contenders versus teams that are just kind of trying to make the Sweet 16. Kevin McCullough definitely has arguably been Kansas's most valuable player this season, more so than Hunter Dickinson, who is kind of touted as the big face of this team. But McCullough quietly over the last couple of years has kind of worked himself into this star status for Kansas. And now this season, we've seen that he's doing everything for them. And when they only have 5 reliable starters and now he's out and they're down to 4, it really makes a significant difference on what they're able to do.
How much difference would Langston Love have made? I know that there's the rotation. They have a lot of guards and others have stepped up. Would he make much of a difference for them? I'm sure he would. But would he make that much of a difference based on where they would be as far as their team, their talent they have on their roster?
Yeah, I definitely think it's not insignificant. Obviously, he's come off the bench this season, but that doesn't mean that he's outside of the top players for Baylor. I have him ranked 5th right now amongst Baylor players in terms of impact. That's definitely a significant loss. And when you have him missing numbers of games this year, and potentially if he's not healthy in the tournament, those fine margins can really make a big difference. He offers a lot of things to this team, especially offensively, that other players don't have. And so I really do think that, especially offensively, Baylor's a really good offensive team, even without Langston Love. But with him, I think, he adds another dimension to their attack. So I definitely think it's a significant loss for sure.
So UConn, Purdue, Houston, Arizona, Tennessee, your top 5. You have, and I'm looking at the ratings right now. You have Duke, and it's locked. What does that mean?
So this is a new feature on the website where there's a few icons that can tell you about different aspects of a team. So the lock for Duke means that they are a consistent team from game to game. So in other words, from game to game, their performance level is going to be pretty steady. You're not going to have lots of high games and lots of low games. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Kentucky. They're one of the most volatile teams in the country, and you can see that on my website. One game you could get world beater Kentucky, and the next they could lose to a bottom level SEC team. It's really all over the place for them. So a big difference between those two for sure.
All right. A couple of more things. You've got a star, like a starburst. Well, that was Kentucky. Wake Forest is that a dripping blood? What is that?
I think it depends. I think it depends on what browser you're looking at. It should be a fire emoji.
I didn't know if it was a drop of blood. Okay, it is a fire emoji. That makes sense. Okay, what is that? They had the huge win, and of course the controversial court storming after the win against Duke.
Yeah, they've been on a hot streak right now. That's what that means. They've been playing really well recently, and it certainly bodes well for them over the next several games going into the tournament. They've been a team that's, even though they've had some big performances this year, they've been in the bubble conversation. So the fact that they're playing so well right now definitely is a good thing for them.
One team that's not playing well, and they are in trouble, is A&M. What is the emoji next to A&M?
So Texas A&M has been a massive disappointment this season, and they've got they've been on a cold streak recently. That's what that means. And honestly, it's not just been recently; it's really been most of this season. They were picked by some to be the best team in the SEC, and I have them 8th in the SEC, and right now their resume is not looking in great shape. So the fact that they're in this predicament right now is a huge shock compared to where they were in the preseason.
It's interesting. You have 3 teams out of the Big 12, Houston, BYU, and also Oklahoma. And those are the teams with that. This team has played worse in the second half of their schedule than the first half of their schedule, despite some nice wins, Houston at Baylor, BYU at Kansas. And that's 3 teams inside the Big 12. Is that because everyone's kind of in this little, I call it a bubble, where they're beating each other up, bouncing back and forth?
I do think so. I mean, specifically BYU and Oklahoma entering Big 12 play. I think BYU was, in the top 10 of the AP poll, and Oklahoma was in it or right knocking on the door. Both those teams have taken a notch down the peg or two in Big 12 play. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not still good teams. I have BYU still as a top 20 team in the country, but they've definitely, compared to some of those big performances and the hot streaks that they were on kind of heading into early January, it's been a little bit more up and down for them since.
With BYU being picked so low, kind of like West Virginia was in football, and they had a pretty darn good year with Neil Brown, is BYU the one outperforming the preseason thoughts of them more than anybody else in the conference?
Oh, I would absolutely agree. BYU, it's been well documented that they were ranked 13 out of 14 in the Big 12 by Big 12 coaches. And my preseason ratings were actually very high on them. I had them in the top 35, I think. And for many, that was considered to be pretty outrageous. And now the fact that they're a top 20 team right now, they're looking at like a 6 seed in the tournament, comfortably in. A lot of people, even after they had that great non-conference run, were thinking, well, once you hit the Big 12, you're going to get slaughtered. And that's just not been the case. I mean, they just went into Fog Allen and beat Kansas. There's only a handful of teams in the entire country who have ever done that, especially with Bill Self as the coach. So huge kudos to them for sure.
When you look at the individual ratings, Evan, Miyakawa with us from evanmiya.com, MIYA.com. Kelvin Sampson has talked about Jamal Shead. He thinks he's the best point guard in America, and it's hard to argue with that because you have him ranked third. Out of all of what you crunch to come up with what you think or who you think are the best players, is it all of the stats from rebounds to shooting percentage to points scored, average team adjustment? How do you do all that?
So there's a couple layers to my overall player value metric, which measures, how helpful or valuable is this player, whether they're on the floor on offense and defense. And as you mentioned, the box stats are certainly a big part of that. There's a good portion of this that measures, your shooting efficiency. Do you have good assist numbers? Do you turn the ball over? Are you good in defensive stats? Those sorts of things. But there's also a significant part of this that just strips all of that away and looks at when you're on the floor, do you impact your team's performance compared to other players? And so when you look at a player like Jamal Shead, not only are his individual numbers, do they indicate that he's a good player, but also when he is on the floor for Houston, they are at their best offensively and defensively. He has a massive impact on their team performance. The same can be said about Zach Edey. His individual numbers are, outrageously good. It's even more crazy when you look at how good Purdue plays when he's on the floor versus on the bench. It's ridiculous how big of an impact he has on their performance. So that's definitely a huge part of this.
All right, last thing. You have Jalen Bridges as the highest rated based on what you do player for Baylor at 49, then Jacoby Walter and Ray J. Dennis in the top 100. How many players for Baylor the year they won the national title were ranked in the top 100, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm pulling it up right now. Let's see here. It was very impressive.
Yeah. I thought there was
I think
three,
it was
maybe four.
The starting five was all in the top 100. So Jared Butler finished the year at 3, Davion Mitchell at 7, and then Matthew Meyer, Maceo Teague, and Mark Vital were all inside the top 75.
Jeez, that was why they won it. Not always why they won it, because of what they had as a team. Evan, thank you very much. I know, again, evanmiya.com, M-I-Y, Evan, Miyakawa, EVANMIYA.com. And it's got player ratings, team ratings, everything you could imagine. Evan, I'm proud of you, what you're doing. Don't forget about the season. Hope to see you soon. Evan Miyakawa from evanmiya.com. Really good stuff. I mean, crunches a bunch of numbers, the analytics of team